Hola, les habla René Salgado, presidente de la iniciativa EmpreSomos Centroamérica. Nos pueden encontrar en empresomos.org. Bienvenidos a este intercambio de ideas sobre salud mental y bienestar del emprendedor, que es parte de nuestro programa EmpreSomos, Conectividad Emprendedora Centroamérica, que estamos implementando en conjunto con CLACS de INCAE y CAMTIC. En ocasiones se tiene la idea de que emprender, y nos referimos principalmente al emprendedurismo por oportunidad, es tarea fácil. Incluso hay por ahí algunos que, sin haber nunca tratado o experimentado el proceso de emprender, llegan hasta descalificar el quehacer del emprendedor. Sin embargo, es de sobra conocido que idear, crear, encontrar oportunidades de servir a un mercado o una demanda o una necesidad social, conseguir recursos o sostener o escalar los emprendimientos, constituyen desafíos que pueden ser tan estresantes que afecten negativamente el bienestar y la salud psíquica y mental del emprendedor, de su familia y allegados. Justamente el tema de este webinar es el bienestar del emprendedor y está a cargo de dos prominentes profesionales. Como presentadora tenemos a la doctora Ute Stephan, profesora de Psicología Organizacional en la Escuela de Negocios del King's College de Londres, con varias publicaciones relacionadas con el tema. Como moderador tenemos al doctor Héctor Martínez, nicaragüense, profesor del Gatton College de Negocios y Economía de la Universidad de Kentucky y profesor invitado de INCAE en Costa Rica. La doctora Stephan nos contará, entre otras cosas, los resultados de un metaestudio de 40 años de investigaciones en más de 80 países, en donde se aborda la pregunta de si el emprendedor estaría más contento trabajando autónomamente o para otro. El doctor Martínez abrirá luego con preguntas relacionadas con los desafíos más fuertes o estresantes del emprendedor y algunas alternativas que pueden ser adoptadas por los mismos para vencer desafíos a la salud mental. Aunque el video de la conversación en inglés contiene subtítulos en este idioma, estos pueden ser configurados para ser leídos en español presionando el botón subtítulos y haciendo la correspondiente selección. Esperamos que este diálogo sea de provecho para toda nuestra audiencia. And welcome Ute, welcome Héctor, and Ute has the floor.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, my Spanish is not very good, so I trust that you said a lot of nice words, and thank you so much for organizing this. And it's a real pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about why we should care about entrepreneurs' mental health and well-being. And I want to start a little bit kind of setting the scene. Why are we talking about this now? Because in terms of research, it's actually a fairly new topic. But it's a topic that really resonates with entrepreneurs, and there are really interesting startups in the UK, in the US, but I'm sure also beyond that, that are actually really dedicated to supporting entrepreneurs. And they often are started by entrepreneurs who suffered burnout and who really adamant that they don't want other entrepreneurs to have to go through the same through the same challenging experience. And so how can we move from thinking that burnout is perhaps part of what it means to be an entrepreneur, which is, I think, the old way of thinking, that you just have to work very hard and that's, what it takes to be an entrepreneur. But, how can we move from that towards thinking, actually, one of the reasons why entrepreneurs become entrepreneurs is because they enjoy their work and they find it satisfying and very meaningful. So how can we leverage that and kind of increase overall well-being? And so why are we talking about this now? I said already there's more research attention, but more practically, I think the COVID pandemic has shown us that mental health is really important. It can affect us all. And particularly what we found in research across 25 countries, across over 5,000 entrepreneurs during the COVID pandemic, was that entrepreneurs suffered really deeply with their mental well-being. Their businesses suffered, but they also suffered personally. And what that meant was often, sadly, that they had to stop being entrepreneurs because they couldn't deal with the stress any longer. And so that's already one indicator of why it matters, because if the entrepreneur isn't mentally fit, then that can damage the business. And there is actually some evidence that shows, conversely, if we are in a state of well-being, especially if entrepreneurs are in a state of well-being, if they get enough sleep, then they're much more productive. They're also much more creative. So they generate these new ideas that, we all like to see and where we think entrepreneurship is at its best. And they're also much more persistent, so they have more energy and can put more effort into their business and sustain even periods of challenge. So overall, well-being matters for the business. It also matters for others around the entrepreneur. So there's very nascent research, but effectively we could say happy entrepreneurs are good for employees, but also we know that entrepreneurship isn't just a job, right? You take a lot of your work home, and work-life boundaries are often blurry. And so there's both positive but also negative spillover effects to the home life, to the partners. And ultimately, I think if we think more globally in terms of sustainable development goals, actually good health and well-being are a goal in its own right. And it's something we all strive. And, you know, on a personal level, what we see from entrepreneurs as well is that they also like to be happy. So it's also a good goal in its own right. There's a business case for it, but it's also important in its own right. And so maybe before we go into the question, I just want to pick up one question I'm being asked quite a lot, which is, so ultimately, bottom line, if I become an entrepreneur, if I work for myself, will I be happier than if I was working for somebody else as an employee? And the answer is yes. So overall, we did a big meta study across 40 years of research, 82 countries, and we see that entrepreneurs are happier, they're more satisfied with their life specifically. So there are various ways of how you can look at happiness. But, and there is a but, we also see entrepreneurship is very stressful. So we also see that especially in constraining context countries, that entrepreneurs are simultaneously also more stressed. So there's more ill-being as well. And this is like one of the paradoxes, if you want, of entrepreneurship. It's a double-edged sword. There are really high highs. Entrepreneurship can be energizing, joyful, meaningful, but there are also very deep lows. It's intensely stressful and it can lead to burnout. And the trick is to manage both sides and kind of mitigate the downsides so that it's a sustainable and enjoyable career. And maybe I'll stop there, because otherwise I'll never stop talking.
Well, wonderful to hear you speak about this, Ute. What a wonderful topic of research. For me, particularly, for about 8 years of my life, I was an entrepreneur in Central America, in Nicaragua. And if you can imagine, I had 8 small businesses going on in one, a lot of micro businesses, right? And so I guess I'm going to rely a lot on my own experience as I think through some of the insights that you provided. And I know that we have a lot of sort of different questions that we want to talk about, but there's a couple that sort of popped up as I was listening to you talk about, and I think maybe useful for us to sort of define a little bit what we mean by well-being, particularly in the context of an entrepreneur. So what is well-being for an entrepreneur?
Yeah. So I think well-being for an entrepreneur, like for every one of us, is both a state of feeling energized, what you do feels right? And it's also the experience of it's a positive experience. So you tend to have more positive emotions than negative. So more joy than depression and anxiety, for instance. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that you can have joy and experience things as meaningful, but things can still be stressful. So there's well-being, and then there is ill-being. And ill-being is the stress, the anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, and in more kind of prolonged states that would lead to burnout and ultimately can lead to mental health disorders, which are defined by basically you're not able any longer to engage productively in everyday life. So that's really when, and sadly, I know examples of that, when entrepreneurs have to be hospitalized because the burnout is so severe that they literally cannot function any longer. And if you think of that, and that's perhaps much more common than we think, because we don't like to talk about negative experiences. There's still a bit of a stigma attached to, feeling depressed or anxious. And especially if you're an entrepreneur, you're often trained, if you pitch in front of investors, you're not going to say, I feel anxious. You're supposed to project a very positive image and a very confident image of where you're going to take your firm over the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, and this also has a lot of, I think, and I'm thinking in the context of Central America, Well-being, of course, as you mentioned a little bit, the happy employer being a better, leading to better employees or having a better experience. To some extent, I think I would posit that lower levels of or higher levels of ill-being, as you're sort of describing, has a direct impact on the amount of time that possibly an entrepreneur would be within the organization. One of the most difficult aspects, I think, sometimes when organizations can actually be a source of stress and discomfort and failure as well, financial difficulties. Sometimes the way to protect yourself is to separate yourself from the organization, and those things, of course, impact quite substantially, I think, the idea of entrepreneurs and their success. The other thing that I kind of want to lean into that you were talking about was the notion of a happier, whether employees or entrepreneurs are happier in the sort of generalized perspective. And you gave a reason why, and one of them, I think, definitely in reading your articles, the notion of agency and sort of self-efficacy are substantial things, very much linked to well-being. But where does personality come into this, right? I mean, when we talk a lot about how we understand happiness, right, especially coming out of positive psychology, that the impact is sometimes less on what we do and more on the personality perspective, on how we see things. So I guess I kind of want to ask you a little bit about if you've seen maybe that entrepreneurs maybe do things differently, or maybe they're sort of different in their personality as to others.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So it's there is some effect of personality, but there is, in addition, an effect of the work, right? So one of the reasons why we initially expected perhaps entrepreneurs to be happier in their work and have higher well-being is, as you say, because they have high degrees of autonomy. They are in charge, and in general, we like to be in control. That's a really big source of happiness if you have control over your own life. And for the entrepreneurs, they don't just have control over their immediate work, they actually shape the organization, their entire job and organization in the way they like it to be. So that's a lot of control. It's also very meaningful work, but you're right. And it's also work that I think it's suited to if there is a personality type, it tends to be, as you say, quite confident, self-efficacy, very proactive, right? Opportunity spotting, and also quite innovative. So we see that entrepreneurs tend to be more creative. However, I want to kind of caution that there has been a long line of research trying to find the entrepreneurial personality. And whilst these are important variables, they don't determine entrepreneurial success on their own. They're also not the only determinants of well-being. But we do see that entrepreneurs who have a lot of autonomy, for instance, enjoy that more when they're also confident and proactive and innovative. So there's certainly an effect, but it can also, and I think we're at this point in the research where we're starting to look at this, there could possibly also be too much of a good thing, right? So if you're very confident and you're running a business where ultimately you set your own goals, you can always do more, right? You can always acquire a new customer, grow into a new market, add a few more employees. There is no boundary that's been set for you. And so if you combine it with a personality type that seeks challenges and likes to be proactive, we see a bit of a danger that you're almost over-exploiting yourself, right? You're taking more on than is good for your well-being specifically. And it doesn't, I think the tricky bit is that it doesn't feel like you're taking on too much because it's enjoyable, it's meaningful. If you have success, that gives you extreme boost for what you're doing because, it's all of your own making. So it's a really strong signal that you're doing the right thing, that you're a competent entrepreneur, competent human being even. But what our body notices is how much energy we spend. And, stress in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's evolutionary, very functional. If there is a challenge, we mobilize energy and then, we run away from the lion or whatnot. So we overcome the challenge, but then our body needs to rest because if it's constantly under pressure and constantly has to mobilize energy, we know from medicine that there's a physiological buildup of what's called allostatic load. And over time, that basically means that our body wears out. And that shows up in terms of both mental but also physical illness. So stress, in a way, is a silent killer. You may not really feel it, especially when you're an entrepreneur who is predisposed to enjoy challenge and feels very confident about the things you're taking on, but your body can only forgive you so much. And then over time, you build up this allostatic load. And if you do not reset that, because clearly, there is stress, I think entrepreneurship is stressful, but if you don't also invest in self-care and give your time every once in a while itself a timeout, then that can be really dangerous in terms of real physical illness. And we know that people who have a lot of stress are simply dying earlier.
Yeah, I think also the fact that, as you sort of mentioned earlier, that sort of line between professional life and the rest of your life is a lot more, it's permeable, and it's sometimes even blurred, right? And so there's no moments of independence between the two. Really sounds very familiar to me when you're saying all these things. All right, so let me ask you one other question I was thinking about as you were going through this. So what should a new entrepreneur know about what it feels like or what it should be like, and sort of some higher level takeaways for them to sort of be prepared for what they're going to face as far as well-being and mental fitness?
Yeah. So I think I would love, in an ideal world, we teach entrepreneurs business plans, we teach them how to pitch and all of those things. I would love if we also taught every entrepreneur some basic stress management skills and just put into their mind that it's going to be stressful and that they need to look after themselves. And that's a way of de-risking their investment into the venture, because there is no venture without them. And so, there's no good if they burn out. And as I said, stress is a silent killer, so it's tricky to see the early warning signs. But if you have a partner, I can guarantee you the partner is going to see the early warning signs. So ask others. But also, it's kind of little steps, right? I'm very conscious that entrepreneurs work the longest hours of anybody in the workforce. So it's not about adding more to your agenda, but it's more kind of recognizing that actually, if you invest in self-care and do, as part of your daily routine, few activities that we know can help you restore and rebound from the stress, if you build it into a daily activity, again, just needs to be a little thing, and you do that over time, right from the start, you're going to be more productive, more creative, more persistent, and ultimately more successful in being an entrepreneur. And so what could these little things be? So one of the things, whatever you do, try and get enough sleep. So sleep is extremely important. We know that during sleep, physiological recovery takes place. There is different numbers. Sleep is very individual, so it's not about 7 hours. Some people need 8.5 hours, 9 hours. So find out for you how much sleep you need. Try and track your sleep, maybe, if you can. These days, it's very easy with these watches, for instance. And we really see that if you get a good night's sleep, and so in our research, we actually fitted entrepreneurs with these watches, tracked their sleep. And what we saw was that half of the variation in creativity was day to day. So it actually mattered more how much sleep you got compared to what personality trait you had for being creative. So get enough sleep. Sleep is good for creativity. Sleep is good for well-being. You're more productive if you sleep well. But then also think about whether there's a physical exercise is very good. Is there some little thing you can do that you maybe also enjoy? So personally, I'm not a big fan of physical exercise. I'm not sure I can even say that because I researched this, but I do try and get at least 30 minutes of brisk walking in every day. And if you live in London, that's not a problem because you can walk to tube stops and that's it. And actually, you walk, and while you walk, you actually clear your mind also and prepare, for instance, for the next meeting. But it's a matter of getting your heart rate up for 30 minutes at least, so that it kind of helps your body to restore and reset the stress effects. And other things, it can be for people. We know that entrepreneurs can often be leading quite lonely lives. So if they have a family, maybe that's a family, but they often don't have friends. Friends can be very important because you can get social support on different issues from them. And we also see that sometimes families of entrepreneurs feel a bit overburdened because they hear issues that also quite threatening to them when the business isn't doing well, because often the whole family, depends on the business. So also think about socializing with friends and investing in your network, right? And again, that doesn't have to be much, but maybe there's a day a week where you can meet somebody, and maybe it's once every 2 weeks. So it's the little things, but doing them regularly that really matters.
What a great sort of thing. I think those are just in general good ideas as well, right? There's a great article I remember on managing your energy as opposed to your work, right? And it talks about sleep, about eating well, and exercising, and also having some spiritual perspectives as well. So tell us a little bit about your meta-analysis and what some of the big takeaways that you found. What an incredible research project.
Yes, and I should say, if you do a research of 40 years of research, you don't do that on your own. So Andreas Rauch and Isabella Hatak have been really fantastic collaborators on that. It's a lot to read and very enjoyable though. And so basically, I think the first contribution we tried to make with this is really to sort out that we should be quite careful how we assess well-being, especially recognizing that you can have both well-being and ill-being. And so sometimes we just mix these things, but now we're a bit smarter, and we actually have a whole science of well-being that tells us that there is a continuum, but also that for specifically challenging situations, it makes sense that you both can have both well and ill-being. So on average, entrepreneurs are happier, but then the big caveat that indeed it also depends on where you are. And so we looked at over 82 countries, which I think is quite unique because a single study can only ever cover so many countries. And 82 countries also means a lot of diversity in terms of development status, but also different cultures and institutions. And so we thought, so what is it about the country context that may help entrepreneurs or support entrepreneurs to be happier in their work? Or what is it that gives employees the edge, so to speak? And what we really saw is there are effects for, if you're in a developed economy, it's a bit easier to be an entrepreneur. You have more resources. If the culture is supporting performance, that's also a bit more easy because, you're more legitimate an entrepreneur. We also looked at kind of broadly regulation. That also matters. If regulation is complex, it's just more work for you as an entrepreneur, and that's not a great thing. So that diminishes your well-being. But what really was overall the biggest effect was for something called the rule of law, which you can think of as the flip side of bribery, right? If you have a strong rule of law, you have low corruption. And why that matters so much is because if you have a strong rule of law, things are just a little bit more predictable. So it mitigates uncertainty versus if everything is up for grabs, and especially when corruption is high, you cannot really be sure that the investments in your business will pay off, or whether, the next day somebody comes past your business and says, so would you like to share the profits with us because, we're nearby or something. It's really this uncertainty. Entrepreneurs have to deal with a lot of uncertainty anyway. And if then the whole institutional infrastructure around them is adding additional uncertainty, because it's very difficult, for instance, if you have a weak rule of law, you can't really get your day in court. You can't really take a supplier, and say, now, you haven't supplied goods, I'm not going to pay, or vice versa. That all takes forever if the institutions are very inefficient. And by the time you may get eventually your day in court, you're probably bankrupt if there's an issue with payments. So anything that's enhancing uncertainty really kind of diminishes entrepreneurs' well-being because they have to deal with so much uncertainty anyway. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one of the things that was sort of interesting to think about there with the notion of being in states of both well-being and ill-being at the same time. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that experience, and maybe, and you've talked a little bit about burnout, and I don't know if there's any research towards this aspect of, maybe there's a tipping point, right? When ill-being sort of begins to overwhelm any levels of well-being and leading to some of those reactions that you sort of mentioned.
Yeah, and it's a bit, I don't want to be black and white, right? I think we all have bad days. It's perfectly fine. And actually, if we're feeling a bit down sometimes, that can also help us to focus on the here and now and get things done. Because if we're always super happy and have a lot of positive emotions. That could also lead to a lot of creativity, but that may not be, we might get carried away with the creativity and what happens in long-term 5 years rather than kind of solving issues here and now. So that there's broadly research on emotions and what they do to our actions that's consistent with what I just said. But yeah, I think for the entrepreneurs, it is a matter of how much, right? So you're working very long hours. We know from research on employees that long hours, if you consistently over your career work long hours, again, you have a higher incidence rate of physical illness and eventually also death. So it's a matter of degree. And because you have so much of that, it can't offset all the good resources, well-being resources that entrepreneurs face, right? So you need to rein that in sometimes. You need to kind of mitigate the workload a little bit. And I think we don't see that so much so we didn't see the ill-being effect in kind of, countries with a strong rule of law, for instance. And we think that's to do because it's a little bit easier to be an entrepreneur and a little bit more predictable in those contexts. But if you, on top of your stressful job, then also have to deal with an institutional environment that is against you, so to speak, and makes it even harder, you have to work even more because bureaucracy is even more complex because, the big rule of law means it's even more unpredictable what to do next. Then you seem to get overwhelmed and the ill-being effects really manifest. Then indeed, it would be better to be an employee, at least for your well-being.
Absolutely. I think to some extent as well, when you were mentioning a little bit about the why or the motivation towards being an entrepreneur versus getting a job, right? In a sense, in a market economy, it should relatively be the same, right? To some extent. Obviously, there's extremes in salary, there's extremes in success, but it should be relatively the same. But of course, in areas such as Central America, and this is really, I think, leaning into the notion of the institutionality that sort of supports the entrepreneurs. For a lot of people, there just simply isn't a job, right? And so you're faced with the reality of either you open up a place to sell whatever wares you have, or you don't feed your family. And I wonder if, obviously, I don't know that you have any sort of research based on that motivation side, but I wonder maybe if you can sort of speak a little bit to that particularity of Central America, where in fact the decision is less about whether I have an employment or I have a business. It's more, I have a business because there's nothing else I can do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I know sometimes we forget that if we only ever operate in, quite well-developed Western economies. So we had a little bit of evidence on what's called necessity versus opportunity entrepreneurship. And necessity entrepreneurship describes what you just said, right? You have to start a business because there is no job. There is no option of being an employee. And the well-being benefits really occur for the opportunity entrepreneurs and not for the necessity entrepreneurs. So, if you're forced to be an entrepreneur, indeed, compared to that, being an employee gives you much better well-being. So it's not for everybody all the time. And there was specifically, I think, from Latin America, one studies across a few countries that also looked at being an entrepreneur in the informal economy. And that was, in terms of well-being outcomes, almost the worst situation. Because you have even less control over what you do.
Yeah, I think there was a great study that came out several decades ago now, out of Peru, and talking about exactly the institutionality and whether how long it took anybody to open up a new business, to get a license to open up. And of course, if you couldn't get it going, you had to pay a bribe. And I think it was maybe about a year and a half that finally this individual was able to open after paying several bribes, which of course leans further into opening businesses that aren't legally structured, and of course would even further increase the uncertainty of success in all these things. It's such a task, I think, in some of these areas. What things would you say, perhaps if you can speak to this, would you recommend governments or cities to maybe facilitate the development of healthier more well-being in the entrepreneurial perspective. What insights did you get from your study?
So based on our research, I think there would be a point of saying, bureaucracy is just a stressor in terms of workload, right? So if you're already working very long hours and have a very high-paced workload, then to add more bureaucracy to that. And that's also what every entrepreneur will always tell you, that bureaucracy is a bad thing. Yeah. But, for certain fairness reasons, there is some degree of bureaucracy. I think that's necessary. But, can you think about making it a little bit easier? Are there options around online services that are secure, hopefully, but that provide one-stop solutions so that the entrepreneurs don't have to go out and search every possible opportunity? And I think a lot of countries have made really good experiences with also providing, local business support in the spirit of this one-stop shop. They are going to point you to where you need to go. So simplification is basically always a good thing along those lines. The other thing is really kind of building up a rule of law, kind of a fair institutional structure where, everybody is treated the same. There are no favors, but it's very, you can go get your day in court if you feel treated unjustly. But I also appreciate that that's a long-term endeavor, maybe. And then I think on the softer side, I think it's also important to just recognize that entrepreneurship is stressful. So, can we maybe inoculate people a bit by saying, what you're going to do is going to be stressful, and here's a set of tools you could consider in terms of stress management, that, you build up these quite simple routines to look after your well-being. And by talking about that, we already destigmatize that, it's okay to be stressed, and, there may be burnout. And if you catch it early, you can deal with it. If you catch it too late and you need to be hospitalized with it, it's going to be a much longer recovery. That's bad for you. That's bad for your business, but it's also bad for the jobs that your business creates and the economic output that your business creates.
Wow, what a wonderful insight. I think that's so substantial in so many ways. René, do you have any questions or any things you would like to add?
Okay, let me show myself here. I was very curious about that, the environment in which entrepreneurship takes place. And you, Ute, made it clear that uncertainty is a key variable in any entrepreneurial process. And when that environment, that institutional environment, makes it more difficult for entrepreneurs to develop their enterprises, because then the outcome is, of course, more stress, more uncertainty, and more negative impacts on the economic and social development of that society. And this is a good, it's an excellent point for us particularly, because it often happens that the environment does not facilitate the entrepreneurship, but is quite the opposite.
Yeah, I would actually add that towards some of the things that Ute was saying. The notion also is, how do you attribute the fault, right? If the entrepreneur sort of has a very clear idea that it's hard work, that it's the person that compensates for impossible structures, then the onus is on the person, and leads towards feelings of failure, of dejection, depression, and it's just a bad cycle. Entrepreneurs aren't at fault sometimes that things go difficult, even though it certainly feels that way.
Yeah, and I think that's also, maybe to close the loop there, I think sometimes there's also a sense of injustice, right? So entrepreneurs are often told, you are the job creators, you're the engine of growth, of innovation, of productivity. But then at the same time, they often feel, and in many countries, and I can't comment on the countries you're operating, but many countries, you're not part of the basic social security system. So if you fail, you really fail on many levels, including for your own future and possibly endangering that of your family. So I think, and then you put, if bureaucracy is maybe not very thoughtful, as in making it easy for you to to comply with all the rules that are there as an entrepreneur, then there's this sense of, this disconnect. So presumably I'm, one of the heroes of the market economy, but then at the same time, I feel punished for it, so to speak, because I'm doing my own thing. So I think there is a bit of equalizing to be done. And absolutely, I think it's the job that is stressful. It's not the fault of any entrepreneur. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we actually see that even, the role model entrepreneurs we often put up, if you listen a little bit more closely, then they all go through phases of stress, and they all seem to say, oh, nobody wants to hear about the stress. I'm always only supposed to be great
inspiring and resilient and all these
exactly things.
Yeah. So as we close this conversation, do you have any final things you would like to add that maybe we haven't talked about? We've talked about a lot of stuff. It was a great conversation, I think.
Well, you've asked excellent questions. I think maybe because the one type of entrepreneur we haven't talked about, which I think though is quite relevant, is social entrepreneurship. And I just want to, and we actually don't know that much about the well-being of social entrepreneurs. We do know that many social enterprises are out to increase societal well-being. And I've recently run workshops with social entrepreneurs around their well-being, and I'm struck by how difficult they find it to talk about their own well-being. They're immediately talking about the people they want to help. And so I think there is a case to be made that in particular context of entrepreneurship, which tries to help others, it's even more important to look after your own well-being. And it's not at all selfish. You can't help others if you are not 100%. So again, the self-care is not selfish, but is a way of making you a better entrepreneur.
Yeah, the NGOs are known very much for doing this. They treat also their employees very poorly sometimes, because
sadly,
the demand, of course, of people who are donating, they want the most amount into the end product as opposed to the processes. But anyways, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ute. I think we've had just a wonderful insight from you, and such an honor to be with you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to say my final words in Spanish. Well, thank you very much, Ute, and thank you very much, Héctor. And I'll close with some words in Spanish, okay? Bueno, muchas gracias a la profesora Ute Stephan del King's College de Londres y al profesor Héctor Martínez de INCAE por este interesante e inspirador diálogo sobre el bienestar de los emprendedores y su importancia e impacto en el desarrollo económico social, que es parte de las cuestiones que abordamos en nuestro programa EmpreSomos, Conectividad, Emprendedora, Centroamérica. También agradecemos la atención de nuestra audiencia y les recordamos que algunos de los temas que estaremos tratando en nuestras próximas entregas con el apoyo de expertos incluyen, entre otros, inversión de impacto, habilidades y actitudes emprendedoras para el éxito en el mundo moderno, procesos de incubación de iniciativas, procesos de aceleración también. Y si están interesados en estos intercambios de conocimiento, los invitamos a suscribirse al canal de EmpreSomos en YouTube. Muchas gracias de nuevo y seguimos en contacto.